I don't really think of things in terms of favorites anymore, but by any reasonable measure, I think the Mars Volta might be my favorite band. It's kind of a weird thing. They've always been there and I've always liked them, but I realized a few years ago that I probably spend more time just listening to their music for fun than I do any other band. So here we go, you know the drill, let's talk about their music. Talk about the first few sections from Tetragrammaton and use them as a way of making some generalizations about some of the harmonic and sonic worlds that they build, and then talk about some of the formal shapes that they create by juxtaposing these worlds. I don't know about you, but I don't really feel any need for further ado, so let's go without further ado. Here's harmonic world number 1. This is the kind of chromatic-y thing that's in the song's first section. The section is built on an 8-measure bass loop, which starts on B and moves around chromatically, following a kind of loose pattern of alternating up and down motions each measure. This bass line doesn't stick to any particular scale. It kind of just fills in the chromatic space above and below B while still making it clear contextually that B is the pitch center because it starts and ends each of these 8-measure blocks and because it's always approached by half step from either above or below. In the first block, Omar's guitar decorates the bass notes several octaves up with neighbor notes and passing tones, again filling a chromatic space around these notes. In the second block, Omar starts a noodling triplet guitar line that evokes a few different types of sounds. At a zoomed out level, this block contains all 12 pitch classes. It's definitely a pretty chromatic, chaotic section, but also still emphasizes B as its pitch center. Everything always starts on B and everything approaches B by step in a way that hints at an F-sharp 7 chord in the last measure. Also, it's not just an undifferentiated harmonic barrage in between. There are plenty of little recognizable patches that draw from familiar pitch collections. There's chromatic stuff that makes it sound kind of bluesy. There are octatonic fragments, also known as diminished scale fragments or half-whole fragments, which have 2 sets of half steps separated by a whole step and have a very distinctive sound. And then there are also hexatonic fragments, famous from dividing the octave into 6 equal parts, and also from the harmonic minor scale. So these are 2 sets of half steps separated by a minor third, which also have a very distinctive sound. None of these scales would be a perfect label for what this guitar part is doing. They all show up in a few parts of the riff, and more importantly, they're all mutually exclusive. So if you have a hexatonic fragment, that means it cannot be a blues scale or a octatonic scale, and vice versa. I think this raises an important point, though. A kind of caricature of what music theory is that it's just learning a dictionary of labels for scales, chords, forms, etc., and that you just pull these out and stick them on music, and boom, you've done an analysis. That would be pretty boring. The labels can be useful for comparing and communicating, but they're normally not going to fit all that well when you're talking about a specific bit of music. One of my mentors put it in a way that I like. With most music theory concepts, like for example in this case blues scale, octatonic, and hexatonic, it's best to treat them like adjectives where you can have less or more of them in a given situation rather than simple binary on-off labels. So in this case, I hear this passage as dabbling in all these different worlds in a really fun and cool way. It's kind of a B minor thing, kind of a bluesy thing, kind of an octatonic thing, and kind of a hexatonic thing at different times. the last time through this 8-measure block, there's a second guitar part harmonizing the first one mostly in minor thirds, adding to the octatonic or hexatonic vibe. So that was the first harmonic world, which was a chromatic type of thing that still incorporates a few different distinctive flavors. Here are a few other quick examples of this type of world in their music. Alright, on to the second harmonic world, which is in the next riff. This next riff has a version of tonal functional harmony that is also super cool and characteristic of the Mars Volta. This is a 20-measure loop in B minor that plays with different ways of creating momentum. That's one of the things that tonal harmony does best. It's a way of creating a sense of expectation and forward motion. Tonal harmony is all about pattern recognition. If you've grown up listening to tonal harmony, you have a lot of practice hearing something like this be completed like this. And that can mean that the middle chord, the 5-7 chord, feels like it's magnetically charged to return to 1. We also have a lot of practice hearing other larger patterns in the form of traditional chord progressions. If you grow up listening to a lot of classical music, this progression will sound familiar, for example. And if you play jazz, you can spot a 2-5-1 anywhere. And you can probably also spot a blues form and rhythm changes and the changes to body and soul and any other number of kind of stock chord progressions. And if you're familiar with rock and pop, you have another set of chord progressions that you're probably used to hearing. Christopher Dahl calls these stock chord progressions schemas, and I'm going to stick with his name for these things. I bring these up because I think of this section as a kind of transformed version of one very common schema, which Christopher Dahl calls the walk. Oops, no, not that one. The harmonic schema is this one, which goes 1, flat 7, flat 6, 5. Hit the road, Jack. The first bit of this second section of Tetragrammaton kind of feels like it has this in it, except that it skips the flat 7. It could easily have been a straightforward riff that either went back to the 1 right away or stayed on the 5. said, the descending bass motion continues past the 5. It's kind of a deceptive motion going from 5, so F sharp 7, to 4, to E minor 7. This descending bass motion continues with a quicker harmonic motion, so it's 2 measures per chord instead of 4. Through 3 down to 2, and it lingers on this 2 half diminished chord for 3 measures before an F sharp 7 turnaround that brings us back to B minor and the top of the riff. This gives another type of momentum. At first, it seems like there was going to be this 5-1 tonal motion, but then there's this faster harmonic rhythm combined with a stepwise descent that goes all the way down to scale degree 2, and could have gone from there straight to 1, so there's this other kind of linear momentum, but then we hang out on scale degree 2 for longer and turn it into a 2-5-1, so we end up with that tonal momentum being fulfilled after all. I'm not exaggerating, and I hope you can trust me to never exaggerate when I say that this is one of my favorite tonal sections ever. It's so cool, it's so subtle, there's so much forward momentum, there are such awesome vocal lines and bass lines, and the drumming is just out of this world, and the guitar part has this chaotic vibrato pedal wobble where it kind of feels like the whole thing is delicate and precious because it could fall apart at any moment. Here are a few other examples of this tonal harmonic kind of world in their music, where the expectation of 5 going to 1 gives a sense of momentum and expectation. This video is already pretty long, but let's keep going. We've got one more harmonic world and then some thoughts on form. Come on, let's go. It'll be fun. Harmonic World 3 shows up in the next section, and it's a kind of pentatonic place, the type of thing they use for some of their shorter vamp-type riffs. B minor is still the center, but now it's a short, groovy B minor pentatonic instead of the amorphous B blues, octatonic, hexatonic, chromatic thing in the first section, or the B minor proper of the second section. Here, the riff is short and static, with the focus being on the detailed 16th note groove more than the harmonic motion. And here are a few other places where they do this sort of thing. As it suggested, Okay, so we've talked about these three harmonic worlds, which I think of as kind of poles that different riffs gravitate to in different amounts in their music. And broadly speaking, they stick a whole bunch of riffs like this, more or less contrasting with each other, together one after another in their songs, sometimes coming back to stuff we've heard before, and sometimes leaving it behind entirely. But I'm leaving out one more essential thing in their sound, and that's because a big portion of what the Mars Volta does aren't really riffs at all. They're a band that was not afraid of using noise, broadly speaking, and they did so in really interesting ways. So that's the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video. It's time to embrace the void. I already mentioned the vibrato effect on the guitar in the second section. This is one of the effects that they use a lot that threatens to negate the harmonic order. The other effects they use a lot are delay, reversed and or time-stretched clips, extreme modulation, pitch shifting, and just good old-fashioned making noise with electric guitar. These sections show up all over the place in their music, especially in transitions between songs and larger sections. They don't generally have a pitched harmonic character or any sort of metric or rhythmic definition. They're kind of the negation or dissolution of the musical order that makes up the rest of their songs. When I first started listening to them, I didn't pay much attention to these noisy sections. I used to think of them as distractions between the riffs. But when I took some computer music classes in undergrad, I got a feel for how many choices go into making sections like these, and it opened my ears up to how cool they sound in their own right. In Tetragrammaton, these little drifts into noise are shorter and kind of built into the riffs. The first one is very short and comes right after the third section. It feels like we kind of accidentally fall into these dark, chaotic spaces, and each time it takes a little longer to get out. I think this album has some of the most interesting integrations of these noisy sections into song forms in Mars Volta's discography. Whether it's the way that the non-stop mech-amp texture groove kind of passes through a noisy gauntlet and almost gets overwhelmed. Or the way that the album itself materializes from and dissolves into this noisy drone at the start and end. These noisy sections give yet another type of contrast, and in this first bit of Tetragrammaton they make a cool shape where that third riff keeps getting lost down these dark corridors. Anyways, many thanks for sticking with this very long video. And look, you've pressed a lot of buttons in your life, so you might as well press a few more. See ya.